Well, in the last 24 hours, there has been quite some movement on the Brexit situation, with Boris Johnson telling his counterparts via Zoom in the European Union that he would like a quick and dirty deal on Brexit. What exactly that means, we'll get into that later. And we're very well placed today to do so because we're joined by Colin Chapman. Hello, Colin.
Hello, Bryce. How are you? And later on, I'll introduce you to Piggy here because we're going to be talking about pork in both its varieties, the stuff you eat, and also pork barreling, both of which are very active.
Fantastic. Well, Colin is the former economics correspondent from the BBC. He's been a commentator on CNN. He's worked for the Washington Post. He's been the head of broadcasting at the Financial Times, an extremely illustrious career. He is also a fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs and our former New South Wales branch president. So it's wonderful to welcome back into the fold. Last time I saw him, it was in Australia. He does come here regularly and he loves to talk to Australian audiences. So without further ado, I will hand things over to Colin.
Good to talk to you all, and thanks very much, Bryce, for that introduction. Now, what we're on about today is that this is a defining moment for the European Union. Now, you may say, well, what does that mean? But this is really, really important this week because the EU is facing up to a very, very difficult future. And at a meeting in 2 days' time, this Friday, the leaders of the 27 countries that make up the EU are having a summit. And it's probably the most important meeting they've had in 60 years, I would say, although they've had a lot of important meetings because meetings is what they're all about. But at this particular meeting, they're discussing the whole mess that's been left in Europe by the coronavirus, because we've had more than 150,000 deaths in Europe, but the economies of Europe are in a pretty bad state, particularly in some countries. And the feeling amongst Europeans, amongst the populace, that the EU, the great body that's supposed to fix up things in Europe, has gone missing and hasn't really come with a proper rescue package. But now it has, and that's what's going to be discussed this Friday. And so to go into this in more detail, here is a PowerPoint presentation. So let's go first to some numbers and some context. In its half-yearly review, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, warns of the deep economic scars that will be caused to its 24 members, including Australia, by the Covid-19 pandemic. The OECD says the richest countries are taking on $17 trillion of public debt because of COVID. Debt is set to rise to an almost 140% of GDP. That's a staggering $13,000 for every one of the 1.3 billion people. It's not just debt. As the Secretary General tells us as he introduced the review, there will be massive unemployment. The OECD forecasts two scenarios. I'll take you through this rather complex little chart. The red line shows that the path to economic recovery is highly uncertain and very vulnerable to a second hit of COVID-19 in the final quarter of this year in the northern winter. And, this is important, even if we escape a second hit, it will take at least 2 years to get economies back to where they were before the virus struck. The building on the left is the Concilium in Brussels, the headquarters of the Council of Ministers. These men and women are the leaders of the 27 member countries which are the driving force of the European project.
As the saying goes, the Commission proposes and the Council disposes. For months, they've been arguing about the EU's multi-annual budget. How much should it go up? How to repair the hole left by the loss of Britain's contribution? Where should the money go? Since Covid-19 struck in March, the argument has intensified, with calls for a huge European recovery plan. The sums involved are not a matter for pocket calculators, but for complex spreadsheets and eye-watering amounts. There are no easy answers to these questions, and rifts have begun to develop between nations. Italy and Spain, both hard hit by the pandemic, with the support of Portugal and France, have called for handouts to repair broken regions such as Lombardy and its capital Milan, home of the fashion industry, and historic cities deserted by the tourists, among them Venice, Rome and Madrid. Industry is struggling too. Airbus Industrie, based in Toulouse, was badly hit. Airlines have cancelled orders for its award-winning A350. The so-called Frugal Four, Austria, the Netherlands, Sweden and Denmark, are deeply worried about who will pay for all this largesse. Their understandable concern was shared by Germany and some others. Germany, the continent's powerhouse, has been the EU's largest contributor, followed by Britain, which is of course now heading for the exit. The Frugal Four have demanded that any large-scale bailout should be paid by low-interest repayable loans, not cash grants. After 6 weeks of deadlock, the Council of Europe handed the problem over to the EU's top public servant, Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission. Being relatively new to the job, she was anxious to make a name for herself and has risen to the challenge. In 2 days' time, by video link, she will outline a bold package of coronavirus recovery measures worth 1.85 trillion euros, which she brands as the next generation EU. The plan centres on Brussels borrowing 750 billion euros on the capital markets and distributing 500 billion of this in grants, with the remainder in loans. In each case, there would be conditions attached. Controversially, von der Leyen wants much of the grant money to drive forward on what she calls investment and reform priorities. Her strongest support comes from fellow German Chancellor Angela Merkel and France's Emmanuel Macron, Europe's power brokers. But the plan also needs the backing of the entire Council of Ministers. There's a lot riding on this meeting. If the plan is not approved, it'll signal the failure of the EU to show leadership in arguably its biggest ever challenge. The EU has never used the financial markets to raise a sum of money remotely as high as this, and I couldn't predict the outcome. It's an irony, isn't it, that if the deal does go through, the financial centre that's likely to be heavily involved is London, whose own future is challenged if Brussels and London don't agree a deal. Brexit is not going to get a great deal of attention at this meeting on Friday. Boris Johnson will be patched in for the part of the meeting that deals with Brexit, but there won't really be any serious negotiations, obviously, on this occasion. And the EU will express their views that they want a deal, and presumably Boris will say much the same thing. Friday's meeting is unlikely to get round to other pressing issues bothering EU leaders. There's the ongoing surge of desperate asylum seekers and economic migrants from the Middle East and North Africa. There's the worry of incursions by Vladimir Putin's Russia on the Baltic states as well as Ukraine. There's climate change and much, much, much more. But I'm going to turn now to the future of Europe's second biggest economy, the departing United Kingdom. It seems so long ago when, at the end of January, Brexit supporters took to the streets as Boris Johnson talked up Britain's golden future, using his favourite expression, the sunlit uplands ahead. He promised then to work for a world-class trade deal with the EU, starting talks immediately. But then the coronavirus struck, and a few weeks later he was fighting for his life in intensive care in St Thomas's Hospital. Now, after 5 rounds of talks on Zoom, there's absolute deadlock. 4 months of negotiations to hammer out the terms of a new trade agreement have so far produced only stalemate and recrimination. The EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, has complained that there's been a complete lack of progress and that Johnson's negotiators have been seeking to distance themselves from promises made by the Prime Minister in the withdrawal agreement at the end of last year. So is Boris Johnson sincere when he says he wants a trade deal? He's flatly refused Barnier's suggestion, which is supported by British business groups, that more time may be needed to agree a deal. Johnson's government last week formally served notice that it will not extend the transitional period, ignoring a parliamentary mandate that rejects no deal. Mind you, Johnson doesn't like that expression, preferring to talk of an Australian-type deal. There is, of course, no such thing. But it sounds good. It's better than talking about operating under WTO terms with tariffs and limitations. If New Year's Day 2021 brings with it no deal, that means tariffs, much tougher border controls, and the full panoply of customs checks. Businesses warned for months against this, fearing long queues at borders and disruption to supply chains, adding to costs. Until last week, the UK government has shrugged its shoulders, saying they'd be prepared and ready for anything. But in the last few days, that has changed into what I describe as a low-key official panic. Why? The fact is, Britain is very dependent on European countries for food and medicines, despite having large industries in both sectors. In 2018, about 1/3 of Britain's food, much of it fresh produce trucked through the Channel Tunnel, was imported from the EU, and the volume has been growing. Last week, in a little noticed announcement, it emerged the government would not, after all, introduce detailed border checks on trucks coming into the country, or tariffs. It hoped the EU would reciprocate on goods coming from the UK. But Brussels firmly said no. Despite prevailing pessimism, a no-deal scenario is not inevitable. Both sides are going back to basics to try and work things out. The EU is, of course, notorious for brinkmanship, concluding deals at the 11th hour. Boris Johnson thrives on this too, and may just pull some rabbits out of the hat at the lowest moment to get what his advisers call a quick and dirty deal on major issues. But the devil is in the detail, and Boris is not good on detail. Let's examine some key areas. We must turn to the withdrawal agreement, which sets out in legal terms every aspect of the deal Boris Johnson signed in January this year. For the EU, the document was signed by Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel, President of the European Council. At the time, Johnson was upbeat about a deal. Von der Leyen was sceptical, suggesting the schedule was too tight. The codicil, called the Political Declaration, is particularly relevant here. It sets out a framework for future relations between Britain and Europe, with an FTA at its core. It says Both countries are to work together to safeguard the rules-based international order, the rule of law, the promotion of democracy, high standards of free and fair trade and workers' rights, consumer and environmental protection, and cooperation against internal and external threats to their values and interests. And herein lies the problem. Maintaining common standards is a core part of the agreement. The EU holds high food standards and food regulation as an important part of the law. So for years, the UK Food Standards Agency has mirrored the rules of the European Food Standards Agency. Boris Johnson has promised to maintain these high standards in any new FTA with another country, like Australia. You didn't think you'd get away without hearing the name of Donald Trump, did you? Well, he's offered Boris what he calls a beautiful trade deal. The only problem is it doesn't fit with the food standards and other rules set out in the political agreement. For example, the US president wants to sell cheap chlorinated chicken to British shoppers, and he wants to get American hands onto the UK National Health Service. The alarm bells have been ringing. No worries, not a problem. We can make an adjustment. Liz Truss reportedly told her counterparts in Washington, causing Michel Barnier to jump up and down. It also may have surprised Simon Birmingham, as Truss had promised a quick FTA with Australia when she visited Canberra last year. It didn't amuse the free-range chicken farmers in her Norfolk constituency, who stand to lose a fair slice of their supermarket income when American packaged poultry takes over the Sunday roast. It's really not surprising farmers feel betrayed by the Johnson government, not just because of the threat of lower food standards, but also because they know money from EU subsidies for crops like sugar beet may make sugar production uneconomic, and because tariffs imposed by the EU in the event of a no-deal Brexit will harm British meat exports. Harvesting seasonal fruit and vegetables has already been hit by a shortage of pickers from Poland and Romania, discriminated against by new immigration rules. Within the EU single market, UK meat exports have had a good run, having long recovered from the bans imposed during mad cow disease of years ago. But they face a real challenge if no deal leads to a European tariff against meat exports, the arrival of US beef, and a decline in red meat consumption. Nor does it bode well for the prospects for Australian cattlemen. Then there's the NHS. Johnson has promised there can be no American incursion, but the US is already present in every British high street. Boots and Lloyd Pharmacy, both wholly US-owned, dominate the market over-the-counter drugs, NHS prescriptions, and a range of other medical products. A growing number of group doctors' surgeries are also owned by US investors. And then there are fisheries, another contentious issue between Britain and the EU. Boris Johnson wants to close off British waters in the Channel, North Sea and Irish Sea to European vessels, subject to a limited annual quota. The impact will be particularly severe on French and Belgian fishermen who have fished cod and haddock for centuries. The fishing grounds are richer on the British side, and the Belgian, French, Danish and Dutch are leading the campaign for full EU access to all waters beyond the present 12-mile offshore limit. France's President Macron has a silver bullet for the UK. Compromise, he says, or we'll stifle your financial sector in Europe. Despite NHS hospitals adapting well to cope with the Covid-19 emergency, the UK has been the second worst hit country in the world. shocking government stuff-ups, administrative failures, led one day in April to UK deaths being more than the entire EU 27. And Covid-19 has wreaked havoc on the economy. Figures for April just published spell out the mayhem. Aviation suffered a 92.8% fall. Car output was down 90.3%. Food and beverages down 88.5%. Hotels 86.9%. There will be no quick recovery. The workforce has been cushioned by Chancellor Rishi Sunak's job furlough scheme, whereby the government pays 80% of employees' wages until the end of July. But ministers are braced for more job cuts when the furlough scheme ends entirely in October. Economist Will Hutton, Master of Hertford College, Oxford, and former head of the European Business Channel, predicted in last Sunday's Observer newspaper that Britain's decline will be twice the World Bank's global forecast of an average 7% fall. Hutton suggests unemployment could reach 6 million by early next year. The Bank of England and the Chancellor have to find a way out of this mess. The central bank is already cranking up the printing presses, fueling the biggest surge in money supply the country has ever seen. It's also pushing banks to lend to troubled businesses and individuals and cut the bank rate to 0.25%. Government debt could rise to £3.5 billion. No one knows how it will ever be repaid. So, to conclude, all this points to a grim future, particularly for young Britons embarking on their first jobs or on the dole. The 48% who voted in the 2016 referendum to remain in the European Union, rejecting Johnson's cry of a global golden Britain rid of Brussels, are now asking why, oh why, are we not part of the bold EU recovery plan being discussed this Friday?
Okay, thank you very much, Colin. That was a fantastic presentation. Oh, where have you gone?
I'm here.
Oh, good. And oh, there you are. Good stuff. Okay, well, fascinating discussion on current events. I do want to turn back to those recent developments, the developments over the last 24 hours, and I'd ask you to flesh them out a bit more. So Boris Johnson, as we've said, has told his EU counterparts that he wants a very quick deal. How likely? Well, we kind of know already how his counterparts have responded, but how likely is it that there will be some movement on the issue?
Well, there'll be some movement, but I think what's happened here is that Boris hasn't really kept to his word on the renewal part of the withdrawal agreement, which I described there. And so Boris took it upon himself, and he hasn't really said much about the deal, the trade deal at all in recent weeks. But he suddenly zoomed in on Charles Michel, he's the chairman of the council, and told them, look, pull your fingers out. We want a deal. Let's get it done. We can get it done by July. And he used the expression, why don't you put a tiger in your tank? Mm-hmm. Well, the Europeans replied to this and saying, well, they've been talking all along and very happy to meet very soon. And they will work now in the next few weeks to try and find some way of a compromise. But after Mr. Michel, the president of the council, tweeted out, he said, I don't want any kind of pig in a poke deal that Boris Johnson is talking about. That won't work for the EU.
Okay, fantastic. Right. The top question is from a lady we both know well, and she's indeed a lady, Zara Kimpton, the National Vice President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, has asked about the UK and Australia, and they've just started talks about an FTA. Zara writes that last week both sides of politics in the UK used a parliamentary debate to demand legally binding trade protection for domestic farmers. Do you think this will make it difficult for Australia and the UK to sign an FTA? Are British farmers prepared to compromise?
Well, I don't think it's the farmers that are not prepared to compromise. I think the farmers have been let down by the government, basically. And what is interesting here, as Zara probably knows, is that the farmers were one of the big constituencies that voted for Boris in last October's election. But their interests don't seem to have been strongly supported if they're going to be sold out to the Americans in the way that I described. But even if that's not the case, and even if there isn't going to be the kind of deal that Donald Trump wants, and if there is going to be a deal with the EU, there is going to be a problem over beef, because at the moment, Britain sells an awful lot of beef to Europe. It's very popular there. And if there's a no deal, if the talks fade, then there will be a tariffs on British beef and on British pork and on other things. And the Australians are very, very keen to get Australian beef into Britain and on a larger scale than they have now. And that's the big sticking point in any trade deal with Australia, which is why you don't see a great deal of progress in negotiations between Britain and Canberra at the moment.
Okay, let's go to Nigel Rogers, who had the first question. So Nigel, and on that point actually of no deal, Nigel asks what you think the likelihood is of a new deal. And if there, a no deal. And if there is a no deal, how viable is it for Britain to go back to WTO rules, especially given that we're seeing a kind of erosion of the rules-based international order, with the United States in particular not upholding those trade rules and other rules that have cemented the.
It goes back to that expression, a quick and dirty deal, which is not no deal. Because no deal is very, very bad news, actually, for both sides, not just for Britain, but for the European Union too. They want a deal as well. So a quick and dirty deal means a deal without much detail, just the headlines. And what it really means is no tariffs, I suppose. So you don't have the wonderful scenario that we have at the moment between Britain and the EU, where there's a single market and everything's traded freely and so on. But you have no restrictions. And so people can come and go more or less as they want. People will be able to trade without tariffs between all the countries in Europe, including Britain. And they'll find some measure of agreement on very important issues like aviation and shipping and fishing and so on. But there won't be, Britain will still have control. Boris Johnson is very keen on control. We must keep control. And so the possibilities for a compromise lie when you say you're going to reach the same food standards, say, but you may do it different ways. That's what Liz Truss was hinting about when she sort of let the cat out of the bag in talking to the Americans. The same with other kinds of regulations. You do allow the Europeans to start fishing more in waters which at the moment Boris claims are British. But they have to come back every year to negotiate how much catch they can take, and so on. Now, this is where you end up in a problem because there's a lot of detail there. And as I said, Boris doesn't do detail. I'm not joking. He really doesn't. He lets other people do that. And what that means is that you might get some headlines of what might be quite a good deal, but a lot of these other matters will have to be finessed after the expiry of the withdrawal agreement, and the EU doesn't really want that. It would like everything to be buttoned up before the end of the withdrawal agreement, which means an extension. And the Brits are absolutely insistent that there will be no extension.
Okay, great. We have a question from Philip Mines, and he wonders what the impact this will have on London as a financial centre. Indeed, are we going to see the international finance mechanisms moving away from London and to Frankfurt or Paris or Amsterdam? I would think, or have we been seeing this already?
Yes, we have, but I think it's too early to write London off as a financial centre, even if in a worst case scenario, and even if President Macron carries out his threat, and he, of course, is not in a position to carry out that threat without the agreement of all the other 27 members of the EU anyway, which quite like using London as a financial centre. But what we have seen is some big international companies build up their positions and in some cases moving their offices to other potential financial centres, and they are probably in order. Frankfurt, obviously, but not everybody wants. I don't want to be disparaging to the Germans. It's a nice city, but not every top banker, top broker, top trader wants to move to Frankfurt. Dublin is getting some business. Amsterdam is getting some business. Paris would like to get a lot of business, but that's not necessarily the best place to do business because of French taxation arrangements. And what you have to remember here is that although the European Union is a union, the taxation arrangements differ in each and every country within the union. And so London so far has had a tax position which is more favorable than almost anywhere else except Luxembourg. But Luxembourg is not where everyone's going to go and run international finance and international currency markets and so on. So most people are reasonably sanguine and think that London will still be a very important financial centre, even in the event of a no deal. But there is no doubt that some of the prosperity of Britain has largely, it's the biggest single contributor to our exports, and they will fall. So there will be a hit there, but it won't be 100% hit.
Fantastic. Okay. I have a related question, and that is from Giada Barone. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. She, I guess, is asking what the implications of Brexit are with regards to regional economic integration in Europe. And I'm reminded of the sketch in Yes Minister when Sir Humphrey explains that the reason Britain is in Europe is to frustrate the plans of the Europeans for cohesion. Now that Britain will be leaving, is there more chance for financial cohesion?
Well, this is a difficult question. It's a good question and quite hard to answer, frankly. Sir Humphrey is still around, of course, in Britain, in Whitehall, and very active in very many Whitehall departments. But there's another guy called Dominic Cummings, who is somewhere between all these people and Boris Johnson, and who is a huge influence, as you probably know, on the Prime Minister. In fact, one of the most commonly heard expressions around Whitehall and in Downing Street is "Dom wouldn't like it" when they float some idea. They go around. They say no, he won't like that, so it doesn't get to Boris. Anyway, to answer the question, the European Union is not going to, some people are saying that the whole future of the European Union is totally threatened. That is a slight over-exaggeration. The European Union is still going to be with us. It is very popular within continental Europe. Most people want it, but there are pressures on it. And because there's rising nationalism in Italy, and the coronavirus caused particular damage to the Italian economy and, of course, to the health of the Italian people. And the politics there, the leaders in Italy are on a knife edge. And so they are obviously pushing for pro-Italian measures like the one I described. Another area of concern, to some extent, is right-wing actions, and a party in Germany which have been getting they're bigger in the Bundestag now, but Angela Merkel seems to have tamed that a great deal and more or less under control. Hungary has become a bit of a law unto itself amongst the former Warsaw Pact countries. Viktor Orban is being regarded in Brussels as a bit of a dictator and a wild card. And given that so much in Europe depends on unity, they have to worry about Hungary. But again, this will come out, I think, to some extent in how people vote at this coming weekend's meeting. And then the other external pressures on Europe, which actually cause problems internally. One of them is Russian interference in Estonia, one of the main Baltic countries, and therefore there is sort of concern in the Balts as to how Europe deals with Russia, and that is something which keeps getting put off because nobody really quite knows how to deal with Mr. Putin. And Mr. Putin seems to have gone to ground a bit lately.
Yes, indeed. We have a couple of questions now that are on the same topic, and I think that's a very important topic. Christopher Skinner and Gaji Garima Kalita have both asked about the influence of China. I guess Europe is the end point of the Belt and Road strategy, so it plays a very important role in China's economic development. But how has the pandemic altered or sped up or slowed down economic relations with China? What effect is it having on the politics of Europe?
Very good question, and very difficult again to answer that one, because let's start off by assuming that everyone is either from Australia or understands Australia's position. The European position is really similar to Australia's, but not quite so outspoken and bold. And so the Europeans have, I suppose, tried not to upset the Chinese the way that the Australians appear to have upset Beijing. But then, of course, you have to assume that a certain amount of the anti-Australian feeling is confected by Beijing, and Australia is an easy target, and it's not a good thing for Europe or the Chinese to start sort of pitching into European views. But the Europeans are very anxious to maintain a good relationship with China, but on the other hand, they are very unwilling to have China take over and take over their industries, the way, in fact, take over European property, and Britain, which was a member of the Union and is still in the transitional agreement, is also rather closer, I think, to the European Union position than it might be to the Australian position, even though Boris has expressed support for the Australian position. And that's because the British have allowed Huawei to have a role in their next generation phone network. It's a limited role, but nonetheless it's a role, and it annoys Donald Trump enormously, and he bats on about it every time he makes any comment about any relations with Britain. Also, China is involved in nuclear power stations in Britain, and is in fact building one of them, and a lot of people both in Europe and in Britain are very uneasy about this. And this comes back to another issue about the deal. Even in no deal, the British do want to have a good relationship with Europe on security. And when they talk about security, they talk about the threat from countries like Russia and China. And the Chinese threat is seen just as much in terms of cyber warfare and cyber attacks as it is on anything more physical.
Okay, fantastic. So we have two
more
more
to be said on this. In fact, there's almost the subject also should be the subject of perhaps not with me, but the subject of a separate webinar with someone like Professor Kerry Brown, who I know is a friend of the Institute and is in charge of the China Department at King's College in London, and the former from Sydney University, is an expert on this particular point.
Thanks for the tip. Okay, so we have a couple of questions around the same theme again, or almost identical actually. A couple of months ago, if you talked about Brexit, a lot of the discussion would have been about Ireland and how the border situation would work. Now we have questions from Zara again and Andrew Farron, I think. Yep. On this point, I wonder if you can shed a bit of light on that. Has there been any movement?
Well, yeah, I can throw some light on that, because you may remember when the negotiations on Brexit were concluding, one of the biggest issues was there going to be a border down the Irish Sea between Britain and Northern Ireland? And the EU basically insisted that there would have to be, because you couldn't have a situation whereby there could be free trading between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland if Northern Ireland wasn't given some kind of exemption. So Northern Ireland could trade freely with the Irish Republic, but then there'd have to be a border down the Irish Sea. And Boris said, no, there will be no border down the Irish Sea, and this all got fudged. The Brits are quite good in negotiating and fudging certain issues, and this got fudged. But anyway, that was Boris stating it, and people believed it at the time. It has emerged in recent days that actually Boris signed an agreement with the support of Northern Ireland that there would be customs checks between Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom, which the Democratic Unionists insisted that under no circumstances would they accept that. And right to the last, they said, no, this would not be acceptable. But in fact, Boris had given that away, and there are going to be assuming things continue with a deal, there are going to be customs checks on the borders on the border between Britain, but it won't be down the Irish Sea, obviously. It'll be in Dublin, in Belfast and in the key ports and in the United Kingdom.
Very good. I want to turn to focus more on the pandemic itself now, and in particular what it's doing for relations between countries in Europe. When Italy was hard hit by the pandemic, it did put a request forward to other countries for assistance, and not much assistance was forthcoming, at least initially, it has to be said. Is that sort of issue driving a wedge between countries in Europe still?
Yes.
That question is from Master Nabizada, by the way.
Yes, Bryce. Yes, Bryce. I'll come to. That is one of the things you see that relates to this Friday's meeting. The Italians, the Spanish, particularly, were begging for help, and as I said earlier, the EU, the Commission, and everyone else went missing. Well, of course, the Commission has been in a transition. There are new people running it now at the top because of the change that took place in January. So it took a while for Ursula to get a grip on the whole thing, which she does appear to have done. But the previous leadership, they sort of retired quietly into the sunset. And of course, January was January. And then the British left at the end of January. And now, and really nothing happened. Everyone said there must be a European recovery plan, but who was to get it together? The European Bank came up with various ideas, but they were probably too modest, and in number, the amount of money required is absolutely huge, as I explained earlier. And so this led to a lot of the problems in Italy, and a lot of people saying, well, what are these people in Brussels doing for us? So that's this Friday. I do want to, if I may, Bryce, if you'll let me just explain, because I said that the British had stuffed up the whole handling of the coronavirus. And since you mentioned it, and somebody tweeted me about this also, the first thing they did was they were too late in acting. They allowed people, millions and millions and millions of people from Italy, from Spain, from infected areas, from anywhere in the world. There were not even any temperature checks at British airports, let alone any kind of testing or anything else. And so there was a large flood of people came into Britain, and whereas Australia, for example, shut its doors, had to let a few people off a cruise ship, as we know, in Sydney, but basically shut its doors. Britain stayed open until just 3 weeks ago, when suddenly the Brits decided to insist that anyone arriving in Britain from overseas has to be quarantined for 2 weeks. Well, this is, I mean, to say the horse is bolted is much more than that. Then the second thing that went wrong was that the World Health Organization said test, 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 and Britain couldn't test because it didn't have the tests, because it wasn't properly prepared, and then gave up on testing. And so the virus spread and spread and spread. And then the people on the front line in the NHS here couldn't get protective clothing, couldn't get masks, couldn't get gowns. And now, of course, much too late, British Airways has got a flight pretty well twice a week from London to China, which comes back in the 747, empty 747, packed full of protective equipment. Much too late. And then finally, the trace. Boris introduced in, I think it was the end of March. He said in 2 weeks' time we'll have a world-class. He likes that word, world-class trace and test system. It's still not working properly. It's just not functioning because it's centralized run by a private company, two private companies as it happens, and not used locally. And of course, test and trace depends on dealing with local flare-ups. That's the reason it's a stuff up.
Okay, I think if we are pointing at stuff ups, we could also look at some of the messaging. There was, as you know, a controversy in the UK in recent weeks over Dominic Cummings' trip to, was it Durham, and his breaking the quarantine rules. How much is he a player within this question of Brexit and the EU? There's a question here from Nigel Rogers. Was he a key driver behind the quick and dirty deal, as it were? And while we're staying on the subject of domestic politics, I'll also ask a question from Glenn Petrush. And Glenn really asks about the domestic ties that bind Boris Johnson. I mean, given the majority that the Conservatives have in the Commons, how will the PM and his cabinet be held to account on their EU Brexit decision?
Well, let's deal with Dom first. I mean, this became such a massive media story. It dominated the headlines in Britain for 2 weeks, I'd say, day after day after day, until everyone was sick of hearing about it. A lot of people were sympathetic with Cummings disappearing up to his father's farm because he needed childcare, and his wife is a barrister, very busy, and has a small son, and so they wanted to leave the son with somebody the son knew. I think people kind of understood that, although he got roasted for that. But the bigger roasting came when he decided, after he got through the virus, that they go on this little trip to Barnard Castle, which is 30 miles from where they were in Durham, and wander along the riverbank and sit together on his wife's birthday. That's what really got people annoyed, because here there were people dying in hospital, and they weren't able to even to go and to see their dying parents, or even go anywhere near the hospital. They had to rely on Facebook and Skype. So that's that. But Dominic was very influential in that initial decision to not test. When the World Health Organization said test, Dominic said no. We should look at it working its way through the community, and we just wouldn't be able to test everyone. And he knew perfectly well that Britain didn't have access to enough testing equipment, so Boris was influenced by him. And then, of course, Boris went into hospital himself in intensive care and was out of it for 3 or 4 weeks, and effectively Dominic Cummings was running the government. Now, sorry, the second question was. Second part.
It was on domestic constraints. Is there anything to hold Boris Johnson to account?
Oh, right. Well, Yes, you hit the nail on the head right at the start when you said that he's got this 80 strong majority. So the Conservatives are can't be kicked out. The only person they do have a habit of changing leaders, so they could change their leader, but there's no one at the moment likely to challenge Boris within the Conservative. So he is safe in his job, and the party is safe where they are. But the Labour Party, which was a fairly inefficient opposition, even when the numbers were very close, now have Keir Starmer as its leader. And Keir Starmer has got Boris ruffled because he is a lawyer by training. He's former head of the Crown Prosecution Service, which is where he got his knighthood. And his cross-examination in parliamentary question time is absolutely forensic. And you can see that whenever you look at PQs, because you can see that Boris gets quite rattled by them. But what that has done is change the polls. So whereas Boris had a very high rating in the polls, I suppose going back to March, his handling of this was regarded as good. It's now down to 0, and in one poll -3. So Keir Starmer is treading carefully because he doesn't want to be seen to be opposing the obviously sensible measures that are being taken. And I should say one of the measures that was taken has been very good, and that was actually stopping a surge on the NHS hospitals, because at one stage it was thought they wouldn't be able to cope, but they have been able to cope. And by turning things like the Excel Exhibition Centre in London into emergency wards, which actually never had to be used, even though it was turned into a fully fledged hospital. So that's a plus.
Okay, well, we have run out of time. I could keep talking about this for a long time, but it's been an extremely fascinating talk. It's been great to have you here, Colin, and we'll have to have you back at some stage.
Well, thanks very much for that, and it's been a joy to talk to you all.
Okay, great. Now remember, the AIIA is a membership organisation. You can join your local branch, and that will get you free entry into these webinars. A lot of them are free already, but we are moving to pages.
Need more members in Adelaide.
Yes, indeed. And that's our show. Goodbye and good night.